Hey guys, who would have thought on the second day of class already we would be getting behind on material? But so this is if you, before you start watching the video, have the packet out that we worked on the first day of class. And I'm just going to finish it up with you through the video. This way when you come into class on Thursday, we can start getting into the next chapter and have all these definitions behind us. So if you were in my 9 o'clock class on Tuesday, Thursday, we already did this sheet right here, the one that's how do we get our data. So you can skip over this part of the video and then go to the next part that we're going to go over the last sheet. But if you were in my 12:30 class, we're going to do this really quick and then go on. So we have two questions left to answer. What are the different ways that we can get our data? And then once we have a sample, and then what are the different ways we can form our sample? So this right now is assuming we already figured out a way to get a group, a sample. How do we get the data from them? Okay, so these are really just going to be these are really obvious ways to get our data. Okay, and so let me zoom in over here a little bit. Okay, so the first thing we can do, which is usually the most common way, the way that I got data from you the other day, in class, was I asked you some questions and you fill out a little survey and gave me some data. So the first way to get data from your sample is a survey. You can do it, by phone, interview, mail. Okay, so as I'm doing this, I just want you to fill out this sheet along with me so you have it all done. So the advantages of a survey is that you can reach a whole lot of people pretty easily. Okay, one thing you have to be careful of with a survey is that the questions can sometimes be biased. So you have to be careful of that when you form your questions. Okay, so for example, if I made out a survey and I said, why is exercising so good for you? That's really kind of a biased question because in the question I'm stating what my opinion is. So a better way to rephrase it would be, is working out or is exercising, do you believe it to be good for you? Okay, so that's a survey. And so how else can we get data from people? Okay, so another way is by just observing a situation. Okay, so this is really, nothing is being changed, and I'll show you in a second when you change the situation and get results, but this is really, you have some researcher observing a situation and measuring the results, or measuring what's going on. Okay, so the researcher is not actually changing the situation, really just taking in what's going on. For example, if somebody wanted to observe the different ways people act in a class in the front row versus the back row. So they're really just walking into a classroom and seeing how different people act. Okay. And then similar to that would be if, let's say, I wanted to measure the effects of something. Okay. I want to measure the effects of having sugar has on children. Okay. So I can't just observe that. I need to actually give some kids sugar and observe and actually measure the results. So that would be an experiment. Okay, so an experiment, the way it's different, is a researcher is applying, well, usually just a general word for it is a treatment. That just means kind of they're changing the situation and observing the results. Okay, so that's what you do mostly. That's what a lot of researchers do when they're trying to decide if a drug is effective or things like that. Okay, and then the last one is when we can't do an experiment because it's either too dangerous or not realistic, and that is what we call a simulation. Okay, so this would be too dangerous or unrealistic to do an experiment. Okay, if I want to measure if I wanted to see what is the effect of a certain virus if it were to get into the United States, you know, coming from a handful of people from a different country, and they came over, and I wanted to see how fast it was going to spread. I don't want to do an experiment to see that. I would simulate the actual effect of the virus being spread. Okay, so those are the different ways that we can get our data. Okay, so this next slide is going to be, well, how do we decide who to observe or who to do the experiment on or who to survey? So the question we're going to is, how do we get our sample? So this is what we would call a sampling technique. So if I ask you in your project, what is your sampling technique? This is what I want to know. How did you choose your sample? So I'm going to write the 4 different ways, and then we'll go through what each one is. So let me just zoom in a little bit so I have a little more room to write. I can't write that small. So here's our 4 ways to get a sample. Okay, we can get what's called a random sample. Sometimes you'll hear that called a simple random sample, and that's the same thing. Let me come down here. You can also have what's called a stratified sample. You could have what's called a systematic sample. And then you can have what's called a cluster sample. Okay, so let me go back to the random one. We use this word random so often, and most of the times we don't actually have a random sample. Okay, so a random sample really is when each member in the population has an equal chance of being selected. Okay, so if we say we have a random sample. If I go into a classroom and I pick 5 people to be in my group to make a sample, that is really not a random sample, even though you may think you're randomly picking them. To do a random sample correctly, you really have to use what we call a random number generator. Okay, the calculator has one, and the next time we're in class, I will show you that on the calculator. You can use a table or a random number generator that randomly selects the people, or you would take each person in the population and assign them a number and then randomly use a table to see which ones to pick. So it's much harder than you think to get a true random sample. Okay, systematic means, let's say you needed some sample and you decide that you're going to, let's say the whole class, let's say is my population, and I need only 10 people from the class. I want to get a sample of 10. And let's say I decide to choose every third person, okay, and every third person gets chosen to be in my sample. That's what we call systematic. When the sample's chosen by taking even intervals from the population. Oh, my handwriting's getting bad. I'm sorry. Let me slow down. All right. So, for example, I choose every third person. So the key word in here is, you see it's a common interval. Every other person, every 6th person, every 10th person, whatever it is. That's what makes it systematic. Okay, so they're chosen at even intervals. So now if I get down to these last 2, okay, these last 2 are very close. Let me move up a little. A stratified versus a cluster. So let me explain them first, and then we'll write down, and then you'll see that they're very similar. So a stratified sample, okay, let's say I'm trying to figure out how many hours people work at Middlesex. You know, students, how many hours do they work in addition to taking classes? So I find some way first that the people are naturally broken up into groups. Okay, so Middlesex, any college is naturally broken up into majors. Okay, every student's got some assigned majors, so if I took all the majors, that would make up the entire population. Okay, so Middlesex would be my population. Naturally, they're broken up into majors. But how do I decide which people to choose for my sample to see how many number of hours they work? So a stratified sample would go and take, let's say I have 10 majors at Middlesex, and maybe I decide that I'm going to take 20 people in each of those majors. Okay, so I would take 20 from here, 20 from there, 20 from each of the majors, and that would make up my sample. So that's stratified. A cluster is exactly what you would think. A cluster of people is like they're all clustered together. So let's say same thing. Middlesex is my population. The population is already naturally broken up into majors. And then instead of taking some from each of the majors, I take all of maybe the criminal justice, the business, and the early education. So I'm not hitting each one of the groups, okay? I'm taking clusters. I'm taking all of some of them. So let's just kind of write down what we just said. So a stratified, it was, you use it when you want to represent each area of the population. Because in a stratified, you take some from each area, or what we call strata, from the population. Okay, so you break the population in two groups. So what I mean by that, like the population was already broken up into majors. These again are called my strata. And then you choose a certain number, and here's the key word, from each of the strata to form your sample. Okay, versus cluster. Okay, the cluster is where the population, again, is divided into groups. And samples formed by choosing all the members. See, that's the key word there. In two or more of the groups. Not all the groups, because then my sample really would be all my population. So I would take two or more, but not all of the groups. Okay, let me just put that, but not all. Because then I don't have a sample anymore. I have the whole population. Okay, so it's just a different way of forming a sample. And sometimes you can only get to certain people, and you do have to do a cluster. I mean, you can tell from here that a stratified is probably better than a cluster because it does represent each strata in the population. Okay, the last type I'm going to put down here, which we use only if we absolutely have to, so just add this one little thing here, in what's called a convenience sample. And it's exactly what you think. Asking people, or just gathering a sample that are convenient to you. You know, so let's say you were trying to figure out about how many hours students work, like we were doing up there. And you just walked outside, and whoever was there, you said, oh, how many hours do you work? How many hours do you work? Okay, so you're taking a sample of whatever's convenient. Okay, it's only who's there at the time. You're not making an effort to hit all the different types of students at Middlesex. You're just asking whoever's right there. So these ones are usually very biased. Bias just meaning it's not a true representation. Okay, so a convenient sample, even if you're just asking your friends that are around, that's a bias sample. Okay, it's not really reflecting the true population. Okay, so hopefully now you've got the last couple pages filled out. You're going to see I'm going to post on Blackboard that at this point I'm going to open up another short little homework to finish up section 1.3. At the end of the week, we'll go into chapter 2, and then you'll have some more homework, so you might as well, at this point, just finish up section 1.3, and it'll be done, and your weekend you can have to do the new stuff. Okay, so email me if you have any questions, and just enjoy your snow day tomorrow. Bye.